Welcome back on day 6 of the public hearings of the Media and Digital Platforms Market Inquiry. This afternoon we have the South African Broadcast Corporation, and online we have the Chief Operating Officer, Lungile Binza, and I was about to say in studio with us, but then that would sound like I'm trying to take your job. We have Mdpmi Monare, Head of News, and a team to support both. So, Lungile, I don't know if you want to introduce the team or you want Mdpmi to do it from here. Lungile, I think you're on mute. Don't know if you can hear us.
Can you guys hear me? Apologies. I think I was talking to myself there. Can you hear me loud and clear on your side,
Lungile,
James?
we're just trying to sort out the technical side. We can't hear you, at least in the external broadcast. Lungile, can we try again? I think we may have fixed it.
Yes. Can you guys hear me?
Not. I can hear you faintly, but not of sort of quality for the.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe in the meantime, then Mdpmi on that side can introduce everybody both physically with him as well as the team that is virtual on this side. Thanks, Jay.
All right, we'll do that. I think they're sorting out where the problem is. So, Mdpmi, do you want to go ahead?
Thanks very much again. My name is Mdpmi Monare. I'm Group Executive for News and Current Affairs, SABC News. With me, I've got NG Kaplianis, is head of digital audio-visual. That's responsible for both radio and digital. I've got Philip Muyilwa, who is also head of our regulatory and legal. And with him is assisted by Tommy Sadike and Maya Macken. And to my right also got our digital editor who will also be helping me with the presentation, Asra Bradio. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mdpmi. Lungile, I believe you had some opening remarks before we proceed with the presentation. Is that correct?
Yes, but I'm not too sure if you guys can hear me now with this technical problem.
We have you loud and clear now.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. And just want to also apologize to the commission. I was traveling and I'm still in transit. So I'm only getting back to Johannesburg later this evening. And good afternoon, everybody. Also on the line with me is the colleagues that also helped us to put together the presentation for the SABC, both from ENS as well as FTI. So I just want to acknowledge them as well. Colleagues, without wasting too much time, because I will hand over to our Group Executive for Technology, Mr. Mdpmi Monare, to take us through the entire presentation. But I just want to position this from an SABC perspective, that we do carry the public service mandate to inform, to educate, as well as to entertain. And that comes from the Broadcasting Act of 1999 as amended. We've got over not over, but 19 radio stations. And we also have 6 television channels. And then we've just recently, in the last year and a half, launched our own digital platform, which is SABC Plus. From our perspective, and Mushweshwe and the team will talk to this, it is something that is of concern because we do depend largely as the public broadcaster on the advertising revenue. Even though people would think we might be having something from the fiscus, it is actually only contributing about 3% of our overall revenues, which makes us to be, even though we are a public broadcaster that has the public mandate, but we should also be employing some commercial activities in order for us to survive, because we go out into the market just like any other person to compete for the advertising revenue. With those opening comments and the remarks, James and team, we'll hand over to my GE for News, Mr. Mushweshwe Munare, to take us through the presentation and his team. Mosh, over to you and the team.
Thanks very much. Can I continue?
Please go ahead.
Okay. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. I will just start by locating SABC, especially SABC News, within what Mr. Binza was saying is it's a public mandate, which really positions us as a unique media organization as opposed to your ordinary media. Which the reason why I want to emphasize that is the paradox in terms of the funding on the one hand, but also the mandate that we need to serve millions of South Africans, without which we will be negating the principle that is expressed in Section 16 of the Constitution. So that's going to be the scheme, my departure in terms of where SABC comes from, and especially SABC News. We over and above the mandate, over and above the Broadcasting Act, over and above the Electronic Communications Act, ICASA regulations and other regulations, we operate on the principle of universal access, in a sense that we do not have a luxury of segmenting our audience or excluding particular audience in order to meet particular commercial objective. But we are expected to provide a platform to all South Africans. That is why we always capture it in the phrase plurality of views and diversity of opinions. It's a burdensome mandate if you think about it, in a sense that, especially now that we are facing elections, that we are expected to reach every corner of South Africa, irrespective of the economic status of the audience. And that is why, if that mandate is not met, the majority of millions of South Africans actually will be left without any platform to express themselves or to get information from. Having said that, I've already touched on our constitutional obligation, which is Section 16, which obliges us to give expression to all the fundamental rights that are outlined there, which is the right to the media, the freedom of expression, the right to disseminate and impart information. Also, unlike other private media, we are also obliged to give expression to Section 30 of the Constitution, which is more about the right to language and cultural participation. That is the mandate in which we don't have any option from saying whether we have to carry out or not. The SABC news content is expected to meet particular criteria and requirements. As I've already explained, that we operate in a very highly regulated environment, given our public mandate. I've already alluded to that in terms of ICASA regulations and other statutes that regulate us, but most importantly, the Constitution. Unlike other media organizations, I've already alluded to that to say we cannot, we don't have a luxury of excluding any part of the audience. So the issue of plurality and diversity of views, it's one of the cornerstone that says if we don't do that, we'll be failing out in carrying out that mandate. And I've already also alluded to, as a public broadcaster, we are expected to provide our news or other content in all South African languages, not just 11, but 14. 14 in the sense that we are expected to also provide in sign language. We are also provided, we also provide in 2 sign languages. And that also, it tells you that you need, in as much as we are a public broadcaster, you need some form of sustainability, because it means the same content that we are competing with other private media, it has to be also told in different languages, not translated, but told in different languages. You know, a sense that, you know, Gogo Dlamini or someone from rural Limpopo or rural KwaZulu-Natal must be able to say, we are not an appendage to the English news content, but we are very much part of what the public broadcaster is broadcasting. Just for a few seconds, I'm failed by technology. This is where I really miss the book and paper technology. We have already spoken about the obligations to provide our content in all the official languages, but also we are obliged to provide information or cover what we call national, important national events. You know, I'm saying this because my background, I used to be in the private media, in which we can pick and choose which event we cover. But these events, we are not covering them for the sake of government or for the sake of public officials. But like I said, we serve people who depend largely on us as a platform in order to gather information for their basic needs. That is why we have to, we don't have luxury as editors to say, but this is not newsworthy. It's more about the millions of people that we cover. And also, we are obliged to, when we offer our content, especially digital content, to make sure that it's accessible to everyone in terms of the bandwidth and also the cost of data. We do not have luxury to say our audience is a particular high economic segment, but we have to do everything in our power in line with the principle of universal access to make sure that our content is accessible. And also the paradox that I've alluded to at the beginning, that with all this, we have limitations on the kind of advertising and sponsorship that we can accept. As you know, that ICASA regulations and other regulations limit us in terms of what we, the kind of sources of revenue that we can use. But at the same time, while we've got those restrictions, we still have to be sustainable as a public broadcaster. I think we will also show that Mr. Binza has already alluded to it, that the big chunk or the large part of our revenue actually comes from commercial advertising, which is anomaly given the fact that we're a public broadcaster. Unlike our counterparts in other countries, I know the Mdpmi Broadcasting Corporation, 85% comes from the public purse. The British Broadcasting Corporation depend largely on TV licenses. With us, TV licenses is very minuscule, and the rest is really fending ourselves in the commercial arena. while we still have to carry out that mandate, have to fulfill those regulatory requirements, we are still expected to compete. We are still expected to use the the news value judgment in terms of what is news content and what is not. In a sense that if we are obliged that we need to serve all South Africans, but we still have to provide content that is competitive, the content that someone might say, but this is not just content for the sake of it, but it is a high quality, accurate news content. We can go to the next slide. And while we are facing these challenges, the news environment has changed a lot in the last decade or so. As some of you will remember that 20 years ago or 3 decades ago, we used to be the more dominant player in terms of both radio and television. And the news platforms or content platforms have converged so much, have transformed so much that actually the legacy linear news platforms are not the only platforms that people go to. In as much as most of our audience, especially on free-to-air, still depend largely on our linear platforms, but you still have, especially the young ones. I mean, South Africa, if we are to believe the latest census from Statistics South Africa, the median age is 27.6. So, which means that, that particular audience who do not necessarily depend on the our linear legacy platforms, which means that as SABC we are also forced to play in the digital era. There are challenges there, which I think is the thrust and the gist of why we are here today. We, as I've already alluded at the beginning, we largely on digital, we are available on our own platform on sabcnews.com, which is a news platform. And however, most of our audience, we go through the third-party over-the-top platforms. Even though we do use our own platform, that is SABC Plus, but we do depend on third-party, that is for instance, in this case, YouTube. Since we started at our YouTube channel, which is about 2 decades ago, I think cumulatively the live audience that we have accumulated over time, we are taking over 1 billion. But if you look at the proportionality of revenue in terms of the content that is at these third-party platforms, we cannot really with confidence say that we are really getting what is due to us, given the investment and the cost of content. I've already said at the beginning that we are obliged to provide our content in multi-languages, in multi-platforms, that is radio, digital, and television. But if you look at the cost, especially the cost of input, the cost of news gathering, the cost of production, versus what some of these platforms, especially multinational platforms, are getting, and also what they are giving us. For example, in terms of YouTube, the kind of revenue that it's really shared with SABC, it's a fraction in proportion to what is in proportion to the cost of that content. That is one of the issues that we need to highlight to the Commission. And also, just to, while we are there, I'm going to in a short while give over to my colleague just to also explain the limitation and restrictions on some of these platforms, in a sense that while we are not, just to give an example, while we are not supposed to be restricting our content in line with the principle that I've highlighted at the beginning, which is the principle of universal access, our content is exploited in a way that it's restricted in a way that we cannot understand. There's no explanation in terms of how it's restricted on some of these platforms. This is what Asra, my colleague, will be talking about. I think I've already also touched on the issue of revenue, that we are competing in an environment in which we're supposed to be public broadcasting, but our revenue comes largely from commercial revenue, which is really a burden on our public mandate and also a challenge to our sustainability in the future. So I will ask Asra just to highlight the main concerns with the digital platforms. That will include the lack of transparency about various visibility and operational issues, also the lack of transparency in terms of paying for content produced by SABC. Asra, over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Munari, and good afternoon, Chair. So I think perhaps the one thing that we should say is that SABC News, or we, did not necessarily strategically move legacy content onto digital platforms. It was something that we had to do. In essence, we felt like we had very little option at the time. But I think also that there have been over the years a number of advantages for us. However, I also think that we, as the SABC, as the public broadcaster, are playing on an extremely uneven playing field. One of the main things that perhaps we should talk to is algorithms and ranking, and how that limits us as the SABC in terms of our content that we put online. First of all, algorithms are complex. They're continuously evolving. They change all the time, and as a content producer, you actually don't know from day to day what the key requirements are. So if you don't know what the rules of the game are, you're not going to be able to play them fairly, first of all. I also think that they limit, and for me this, on a personal level, this is perhaps the most important thing, that they limit the content that people are able to access. So there is very little, in many ways, freedom of choice in respect of what kind of content I, as a user, am able to access. You might be able to see what you want to see, but how do you then see what you need to see? And that, for the public broadcast, from the public broadcast perspective, is, I think, an extremely important point. Ours is not just to share content, but it's to share content that people need to know, not just what you might like to see. So I think that's really it for us is the bottom line of where we start and how we see our online content going forward. Articles from the SABC up until very, very recently have largely ranked outside of sort of the most popular searches. So if you search for a news article, generally the SABC, even the latest news article, might come up on page 3 or page 4, or maybe not even at all. And that has been a huge challenge for us, because we have not really been aware of what the criteria are. First of all, we've not until very recently played in terms of search engine optimization, for example. And of course, then when your articles do not come up, there is a huge impact on your credibility. If you're not in the top 3, then do you even exist? And even if you are, how credible are you as compared to all those very big, very popular, 20 million sort of followers kind of news organizations? So I think from a public perception of how the SABC shares content and the kind of content that we share, it has really impacted very greatly on our online platforms. There have been also, obviously, then lower click-through rates, etc. So the lack of transparency about how we can improve our rankings outside of search engine optimization tools, for example, has been another big challenge in terms of operationally for us. But there are a few other things that perhaps I should quickly talk to. And one of them is paying for content distribution. And it's not something that is within the ambit of the SABC, so we won't pay, for example, to boost a post, or we won't carry sponsored content on any one of our platforms necessarily. And you know, when we do the comparisons at the end of every month, when Mr. Munari asks us for a report, we can see that it impacts on us really very negatively. We also, in line with sort of universal access, with our constitutional mandate, we can't place our content behind a paywall. It just will not work. It's not in keeping with who we are as the SABC. And so not only does it mean that our content is not shared or not distributed, you know, as frequently perhaps or as widely as those of other more commercial news organizations, but it also means that to a large extent that we don't get the clicks. So nobody clicks, nobody likes, despite the fact when you click on an SABC News article, you actually go to an article and not to a paywall. It really impacts dramatically on how content is circulated online. We've also had some experience with our content in a way being censored, so shadow blocking, for example, and content being blocked, or certain kinds of content being blocked on specific platforms. And even then, to a large extent, initially we didn't even know why our content was not being circulated, why it was not reaching the targeted audience, for example. And it was quite a revelation when we eventually figured it out and kind of joined the dots. So the shadow banning experience for us was a great learning curve. But since then, obviously, we've seen a fair amount of our content on certain platforms being blocked outrightly, dependent obviously on the specific content, like, for example, the Palestine conflict, etc. And of course now with some of the social media platforms sort of outrightly saying, you know, we don't necessarily support news or political content. The other thing that we found from an SABC perspective is the inadequate technological support for our African language content. And I know when you had Sanef in last week, somebody made mention of that as well. The fact that a lot of our African language content is not searchable. And when you do search it, the chances of an accurate search are also kind of uncertain. So that for us has been a fairly big thing, because I think if you can consider our numbers from legacy platforms, so you look at radio numbers and then you look at what we have online, we see very, very clearly that a lack of support for these languages means that it is not possibly being shared as widely as it could be. The other thing that I think I alluded to a little bit earlier is this whole idea of profits versus the quality. And you are measured, even though we're the public broadcaster, as a measurement in terms of news content generators. You are measured against each other no matter what. And the one thing that we see is, first of all, that the quality is not necessarily what the focus is. So whether you're a credible news organization, or whether you're my 13-year-old nephew broadcasting on his YouTube channel, it actually doesn't matter. We're all treated in exactly the same way. and we're all seen in exactly the same way. So the lack of support for credible news content generators, and more specifically for an organization like the public broadcaster, is massive. The other thing which I alluded to a little bit earlier as well is that our focus as the SABC is on journalistic integrity, on making certain that we are highly regulated. So making certain that every single, piece of the way that our content is checked and double-checked and verified. And I think that, I'm not saying that we don't make errors, because everyone does, but I think that our track record speaks for itself. But that is not a consideration. It is not a consideration at all when you're sharing content, especially on the big tech platforms. We've seen it with, for example, the manipulation of our content on video channels, for example, and it just does not bode well for a credible, or an organization that bases our practice on credibility and ethics. And then finally, like I said, the measurements. We're all measured in the same way. The fact that if you click on an SABC news article online, you're actually going to go to an SABC news article online. You're not going to go to a paywall. It does not seem, in terms of the bigger commercial picture, to impact very much. But for us, it is a massive impact and of great concern. And I think that's essentially it from me. Mr. Munare? Oh, so yes, the limited data transparency from the platforms perhaps is a big thing for us. We've had major impact in terms of how our content is being used by online advertising, for example, and by other content generators as well. So our logos are being used, our faces are being used, our voices are being used, with very little control, very little support for getting those things stopped, etc. Also the lack of transparency around how platforms determine the advertising revenue, or is also for us a big concern. We as I'm sure you've seen in our initial submission, do have some sort of revenue sharing with YouTube, for example, but the lack of accountability in terms of, or lack of accounting for that revenue is also of concern. So yes, there is a profit sharing agreement in place, and yes, there might be a payment at the end of the day or end of the month, but how that is determined is still very much up in the air, and very little clarity about that. So the final thing perhaps I should say around that is the manner in which, on an operational basis, these issues are dealt with. So very often it is time consuming. It takes a long time to get a response. It takes even longer sometimes to get a resolution or a solution, if at all. And on the other hand, I should perhaps put in that when you have a strike against you, when you do something wrong, there's very little leeway. And you're very much left to your own devices in terms of having to kind of solve those kinds of problems. I'm not saying that there is a total lack of support, but generally that it is very slow and forthcoming, and often very delayed.
Thanks very much, Asra. Thanks very much. In conclusion, as we have already stated, to say from us is more about leveling the playing field, and also taking into consideration and into account our role as a public broadcaster and also the future sustainability of public broadcasting in a country like South Africa, because some of these multinational platforms do not operate in a in a country with the dynamics like South Africa, with a history like South Africa. And that's where the role of public broadcaster is very much important. And also just to say, look, in terms of restrictions and limitations on our part and obligations, as a public mandate, some of these multinationals don't have similar restrictions, don't have similar regulations that are imposed on us, which is really unfair competition, if I have to put it that way, but also, delegitimizing the...
At last, I joined this.
Okay. Delegitimizing the importance of public broadcasting. Thanks very much. That's all from us. We will invite if there's any further questions.
Thanks, Mshweshwe. I think, Paula, do you want to start?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for bringing such a comprehensive team to the Competition Commission today. Part of the process of having a public hearing is also to educate the public about the issues that we're dealing with. And so, firstly, thank you very much to SABC for your submissions, because they were quite comprehensive. But we're also looking for evidence, and so actual examples of the issues that you're talking to. So I want to just maybe take you through a couple of those issues. And I want to start off by asking the question, you have a public broadcast mandate, 19 radio stations, 6 television channels, your own digital platform, SABC Plus, obviously SABC Online as well. But what does a public broadcast mandate mean when it comes to the actual stories you tell that other media don't do?
I think in my introduction, I'll also ask my colleague Philip to add on. I think in my introduction, I did allude to it to say, as a public broadcaster, unlike any other media, firstly, we don't have any luxury to pick and choose, because it's more about our obligation to the broader South African public. And let's not forget that in South Africa, in as much as there is the saturation of media outlets out there, there are still millions of South Africans that depend on SABC for their everyday information. And that is where, as a public broadcaster, we come in. But also, secondly, I've already mentioned it in my introductory remarks, that the way we package our content is in a way that someone who speaks Sotho, Afrikaans, isiZulu, isiXhosa, will understand that actually we tell their own stories, not translating their stories from, big metros and translate them into a language. They understand that we tell the stories of their villages, we tell the stories of, it's more providing them with a voice. It's more placing us as a platform in order to, if I could put it in a way that, giving the voiceless or the powerless a platform to hold the powerful to account. That is our mandate, in a sense that when someone in any part of the country says, I don't have, I cannot afford to subscribe to a digital platform, I cannot afford to buy a Sunday newspaper, where do I get my information? Because the Constitution says I've got the right to information. I've had to be informed as a citizen in order to make an informed decisions, be it during elections or in any public forum. That's where we come in to say, you do not have to pay for that information. And this is where, as the public broadcaster, is our role to give expression to that Section 16. That is why most of our audience, just to give a background in terms of our platforms, we've got free-to-air television current affairs and bulletins. We are talking about SABC 1, 2, and 3, and that is where African languages, all the languages, bulletins and current affairs are at. And that's where you will see the bulk of our audience. We are talking about plus minus 14 million of our audience there. The same thing on radio. In as much as people tend to think that radio is gone, but if you look at the power, the gravity of our radio content, the majority of South Africans still depend on radio. The last count we looked at about 38 million a week in terms of people who depend on our content for public information. So it's not just the issue of competing for news as someone in the commercial market, but to say, but we do have an obligation and a particular mandate that we cannot fail South Africans. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And to deliver that news, I mean, how big is your newsroom? And do you then have journalists who are reporting in 13 languages, as if you are, in fact, distributing news in 14, including sign?
Yes. Look, if you look at our newsroom compared to our colleagues in other media, you might say it's the biggest. We are talking about plus minus 700 permanent staff. That doesn't include independent contractors in the form of freelancers. The news gathering team, we are also talking about plus minus 100. I'm talking about the input side. However, if you look at the mandate again, it's really an overstretch on the team, because the same team still have to give quality content for radio, for television, for digital, which is more fast-paced. The same team still had to provide current affairs to radio platforms and TV platforms in different languages. So which means if you are ENCA, just to give an example, where your language is just a singular English language, you would understand that the team is overstressed. But having said that, going back to the point that I've made before, that if you look at the cost of producing that content and how it is used in one of these multinational platforms, as opposed to the revenue that is going back to the SABC, it's really something that is deplorable, and also it's really a danger to the future sustainability of public broadcasting.
Thank you. And I think a lot of media... sorry, go ahead, Philip.
Just want to amplify some 2 points from what he said. I think it's very, very important to emphasize that our mandate is beyond profit making. I think that should underpin our role. Whereas other players are profit driven, they do what is of commercial interest and what is within their means. Now, you've asked a very fundamental question around what does it take? What resource does it take? If we were to use a business decision, you shut down half of news, if you understand what I'm saying. But because our mandate is not profit driven, it is more about transformational, it's more about achieving the key fundamentals that are in the Constitution. It's more around redressing the historical problem of access to information by most of South Africans. That is why if you go to the charter in the Broadcasting Act, which is where our mandate is based, you realize that our mandate is just far beyond, even though we are allowed to make commercial revenue. But that commercial revenue is meant to actually help in terms of the delivery of public service mandate. So that's what makes us totally different. And I think the element of commercial gain might be confused when you look at other players that are in the market, because they want to compete with us as though we've got declared dividends to shareholders. Ours is to take from the left and give to the right so that we're able to deliver on our mandate. So that makes us uniquely different. And as initially indicated, that revenue is so minuscule, it doesn't really help much. As I'm saying, I mean, with the news, with the elections now, with all the programs that we have to be run, because not only about information, our mandate is clear in terms of the Act. We have to inform, educate, and entertain. And this is just beyond news. It's across our programming. We need to provide diverse programming across cultures and languages. That in itself takes a lot of resources. So hence we are saying as the SABC, whatever that happens online, if there's no fair play, we are more hard done by. Because a little resource that we earn is meant to really enhance our public service mandate. I just wanted to emphasize that point. Thanks.
So can I just understand, I mean, in terms of the obligations, there are constitutional rights that must be upheld, but are you saying that you solely must also uphold those constitutional rights, or you play a role in upholding the constitutional rights based on your mandate?
Our mandate, I think the Constitution is an overarching body, as you know. We are there to uphold. We are there to make sure that the Constitution gets meaningful in terms of the role that we play as one bigger player within the South African society.
So it was just a question.
If I may,
yeah, please
answer that. Look, in terms of the constitutional, the fundamental right in the Constitution, sure. I mean, if you look at Section 16, it was not accorded to the media just for the sake of them, for the sake of the profession, but it was to the extent that we give expression to ordinary South Africans in terms of them being able to impart and disseminate information. And that is what we derive our power. That is where we derive our mandate.
I mean, so if there's let me call it a retreat of commercial media away from certain reporting because they, as we heard last week, are constrained, does that increase your mandate, increase some of your obligations to ensure that if those are not being heard through other means, that you now must deliver on them?
Under normal circumstances, even with the, let's say, success of commercial media, we still have that obligation. We still have that burden, because if you look at South African society, and some saying that it's a unique feature of South African society, is that the majority of South Africans do not have access to that information, both in terms of affordability, but also in terms of the telling of the story. I mean, if you look at major media organizations, they can only afford to be, in terms of news gathering, they can only afford to be present in major metros. You're talking about Johannesburg, Pretoria, Durban. Actually, some of them have shut down the bureaus in some of the metros. But as SABC, we don't have that luxury, because it's not about a particular segment of a society that is attractive to advertiser, but it's about the fact that we are relied upon and trusted by the majority of South Africans. We are the only organization that still has a footprint throughout South Africa. So in that sense, yes, I agree with you to say the more there's a decline, actually that's what I tell my colleagues, that the more there's a decline in the either commercial media, that burden actually is even more on the SABC to carry out that constitutional mandate and constitutional obligation.
If I may just quickly on this. See, online media is dependent on data. Data is cost. What are the economies of scale in South Africa? This is one fundamental problem that inevitably the SABC will have to come in by default. Majority of South Africans do not have access to data from a cost point of view. Secondly, even though we are available throughout the country, not everyone is able to access the signal. That is still an issue. We've got about plus minus 4.5 people that are actually not even having access to television. So you can see the dependency on SABC as a source of information, let alone any other thing from entertainment point of view. So to that point, that question is much more loaded than just them retreating and ordinary citizens having an alternative. It is a much more economic issue, and it is much more bigger, given that if you stay in an area where there is no signal, you cannot afford a decoder that can give you satellite access, who are you really dependent on? So it is much more bigger than that in terms of it. And that is why our role is there in the statute that we need to provide universal access and service to South African public because of the recognition of these disparities. Thanks.
A number of media have come to the inquiry and have said that the economic crisis that they face right now has actually imperiled in many ways the ability to deliver the kind of news that they want to give to their audiences. Now, I hear what you're saying about your mandate remains whether you have the money or not, but I also know that SABC has retrenched, has had to shrink its staff, etc. So in this economic climate, what is the cost you're paying for this digital disruption?
I can only speak from a news point of view. Look, we also feel the impact of both digital disruption and economic crunch and the bad trading conditions. That is why we are talking about the future sustainability of SABC. You know, we are not talking about profitability, but we are talking about, for the sake of South Africans, you need a sustainable SABC. Whether through public, a particular public funding model, that is another issue. But in terms of what we are saying here is that the content that is produced, the volume of content that is produced by SABC, if you look at, if the playing field was leveled, actually we should be able to sustain ourselves in terms of producing that content and also meeting the mandate that we are talking about.
I mean, you raised the issue of funding, and in response to the further statement of issues that we released, which highlighted the SABC as being almost distinct, one response from a platform was, well, you need to sort out license fee collection and you need to sort out government funding. It's not on the platforms to support the SABC. I mean, I would understand that's a lot more complex. You can't just continue making losses and be funded by the fiscus. But maybe can we get the SABC's perspective on, in a sense, that how deep is that funding that you can get, how easy it is to collect license fees in the South African context, and so how easy are those alternatives to plug the gap?
Thanks. I think the context which we can answer this is to look at the cost of mandate of the SABC versus what it actually is able to access, whether it's the 3% from government, whether it's from advertising, whether it's from license fees. That actually start to show you the dichotomy that the SABC finds itself in. The notion worldwide is that public broadcasters are funded. And the reason why they're funded is not because they do not have the ability to generate revenue. It's because they've got a very unlimited mandate. And let me just throw a very simple example. If you go to a rural area where you have an obligation to make sure that people can access information and content, when you put a transmitter there for them to access our signal, you do not check what is your financial return. You look at the public value that will be delivered into those people. Our counterpart, being a commercial free-to-air, they will check and say, but if you put a transmitter that costs us 10 million, what are we going to get? If it's minus, they'll be reluctant to put the signal. Now, hence we term, I'm now wondering if maybe we might have explicitly put that, we've got what you call unfunded mandate. Public broadcasters' public mandate get to be funded. In this country, it is not funded, and that is exactly where the problem is. So the losses, as a result of trying to make sure that South African public access our services, more than anything, because he make mention of, for example, the Namibian Broadcasting Service, make mention of BBC. The list goes on in Europe and so on. Public broadcasters are highly funded from the public. But here, once the market jitters like we've seen, we're the first to feel the pinch, and we've seen it. And I must add that coming to the online digital debate, there is a growing trend of advertising shifting to online from traditional or conventional broadcasting. So that in itself doesn't make life easy for us, in the sense that our conventional or classical advertisers are now starting to look at the space where it's quicker, faster to make money, which we said we have no control on and we cannot even influence. So our problems are just getting compounded But the change in economy, as we're saying, that there are shifts in terms of where people want to invest and put their money. There are also because there's no any additional funding that we're receiving. And also that even the viewing patterns or the consumer patterns are also changing. So for us to keep up with all these, just using private money as in from advertising, it is just a big to ask for us. So it is very important also for us to get that context. But I think to a large extent, the void in terms of funding of public mandate, it has a huge impact on us. Though we still have to go into the market like another player. And just to even the SABC Plus, I think one of my colleagues have just heightened that, you know, even though we have it, we still need to have a service provider that we pay to run it. So the costs are just getting escalating every time. We just need to want to access money.
I mean, Paula mentioned that you had closed some bureaus, and there have been some retrenchments. But it seems from all the discussion last week, there are a few strategies that are being used to manage this reduction in revenues, but still trying to deliver on news. And others are the use of freelancers, the juniorization of the newsroom. And it seems from what we heard last week that, I mean, although these are not your first choice and you may be forced into it, it does start to impact on the journalism profession and your ability. And so I just wouldn't mind your inputs on that, and also in terms of not just English language, but your African language, where you might be the only ones who are employing people, at least in radio or television.
Yeah. Look, it's the impact is there. You are bound to feel it in a sense that in order to provide that kind of content, you need quality, very senior, journalists. What's happening at the moment is that under the current circumstances, we are trying very hard. But my biggest worry is the fact that if that quality is going to be compromised going forward, remember you are competing with fake news, you are competing with misinformation. And that's where my biggest worry, that really give me some sleepless nights, is the ability that our quality assurance mechanism will be able to pick that this is misinformation, this is fake news. And the reason why I'm saying this is that the majority of South Africans still trust in SABC. I think the current study by Institute for Reconciliation and Justice, if I'm not wrong, alluded to that, and also the earlier study by Human Sciences Research Council, where people will still say we want to know if this is true, we have to rely on SABC. But the more the newsrooms are being depleted, the more we have to rely on junior staff. The risk actually is that. That's the quality assurance that our internal mechanism will it be able to decipher the truth from fake news out there. So it's still a real challenge. But like I said, I've got a fantastic team in a sense that under the circumstances, we still really trudge through. But secondly, in terms of the language, it's still also a challenge, not just from a financial point of view, but from also South African dynamics point of view. My children and the next generations are what I can loosely define as suburban children, who some of them can speak African languages, some of them cannot actually even read or write in African languages. As a public broadcaster, it's something that I also expressed concern with the Pan South African Language Board, that it is a challenge in terms of future provision of content in African languages. It is a challenge. However, the positive is that over years we have become a training ground. We have become an institution in providing multilingual broadcasting, and it's something that internally we are talking about. How do we take advantage of that? The institutional and historical build-up to sustain ourselves. But it is a challenge. It's something that I cannot be defensive about. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I think Philippe began to touch on it, but could you give us a sense of how your audience behavior is changing and shifting online, and what those trends are, just in ballpark figures, what you're experiencing?
But before she goes there, I've already also touched on it to say we still, what you call linear legacy media is still the backbone of our audience. I mean, we see it on your Zulu bulletins, which actually is one of the most performing in terms of the numbers. So free to air, which also go back to the issue of public broadcasting in terms of universal access, it's still the backbone of the of our audience.
So I think in some ways it has changed a lot, moving our content onto digital platforms. At Digital News, for example, we're sharing content on our website via our app, in some instances on the Plus channel, as well as numerous social media platforms. And we've seen growth in some areas. We've also seen some of the challenges in respect of the kind of content we share and how we share it, and also the kind of resources that we have to put into sharing the content. So, not all our content, for example, is tailor-made for each platform, which doesn't bode very well for us, but it's purely a resource thing. We've also seen that while in some instances the audiences are similar or the same, in other instances they actually are very, very different. For example, with the SABC's move to digital and the switch off of some of the analog receivers, we thought, hey, this will be a fabulous opportunity to see whether there's a rise in online audiences, and actually we haven't seen that, which goes to show that, first of all, yes, there is the demand for the legacy platforms is still there. So it's possibly not even the same audience, it's possibly a very different audience, which is key in terms of, if we were to have different resources, the kind of strategies we should sort of be employing going forward on the online platforms. So I think it has changed in many, many ways. Also, the kinds of content that people want to see online perhaps is a little bit different to what they want to see on the legacy platforms. And the other thing that I think is important for us, and we've seen it with a few of for example, our live streams, is the fact that sometimes you are taken quite by surprise in terms of what kind of content people are looking for. So some of our best performing content on YouTube, for example, might be, smaller, not as important stories. But it also goes to show that some international news, which might not necessarily make the biggest news content on any of our television bulletins, for example, or on our website, actually perform really well with the online audiences. So yes, there are challenges, and yes, the audiences have changed and the viewing patterns have changed, but my personal take is that it's not necessarily the same audience. It's probably new and different. There might be overlaps, but different audiences.
And if I may add, I don't know if this is the right phrase, but it's like being a little bit schizophrenic. You've got your audience on your traditional media, then all of a sudden it's Instagram, then it's YouTube, then it's TikTok, then it's WhatsApp, then what next? So we're quite fragmented, but if you had to consolidate us, you'd see the huge audience. And I think just to add on to what Azra said, it's you think TikTok is for a certain audience, you think it's short form video watching. We look at our numbers, the numbers might look low, but the video views are huge, 1 million plus. I mean, and that's not a 30-second video. We didn't go and just do that video for that platform. So there's a lot of learning, there's a lot of trying to figure out things, and just when you think you've got the recipe, something else is happening and something else is changing. But basically, I think like most, we're having to go where the audiences go. And if I can go back to the public mandate, it's an unfunded public mandate. And I want to pose the question, what if the SABC weren't there? Many might say, you know, what a relief, and we don't have to put money into that. But think of that kernel question. What if there wasn't a public broadcaster? What would not happen? What would happen? Call it a public news service, a public media service. Imagine a South Africa without that. Could we live without it? What would we lose? So I think there's a lot of kind of like framing around the questions that we might have to answer and that we're expected to do without basically kind of the finances and funding.
And that is a big question. And I suppose, you know, again, when we looked at the terms of reference even for this, we thought broadcasting sounds important in the South African context. It's not something that's been picked up globally. But I'm just wondering, to what extent is the SABC also being spared a little at the moment because platforms are not good at language, because of data costs, and this might hit harder in future when some of those change. I mean, do you map out your sort of, I'm sure the SABC plans ahead, but do you think your audience mix is going to change much more dramatically as the years roll by, and how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, look, when was it? Was it late last year when the BBC issued a statement that they might have to do away with their legacy platforms and be on digital? It's something that we can take for granted, but if you look at the maiden age for South Africa, like I said, 27.6, it tells you that you need to also position yourself in a sense that actually is where you are heading to. So I foresee a situation where most of our future audience will be captured through the non-linear platforms that is largely digital. So yeah, it's inevitable. It's a reality that is facing us. Digital is no longer the luxury of saying it's digital first, but it's the reality of someone, and it's even more about that the change in consumption behavior. It's more about someone saying, I want to know what is happening now, and I want to know that from the palm of my hand. I don't remember when was the last time I have to drive home in the evening saying that I want to watch 7 o'clock news, because that was the only time that you will know what is happening, or wait for a newspaper track the following day to know that what the president said in parliament is no longer like that. It happens, and people prefer this. So that's where it's going, and as SABC, we cannot divorce ourselves. It's no longer about the platform. I will always say to my colleagues to say, sometimes ago I can call you a television journalist or a print journalist or a radio journalist, but it's more about the content, and where it lands, it's about the audience, and that's where the pull is. It's no longer about, but you are a broadcaster. Even the word broadcasting, I don't see it really surviving the next decade or so.
If I listen to what Asra is saying, it's not that you're taking existing content and simply putting it onto other platforms. You literally have to produce content for the way the audience wants to consume it on the different platforms, and so there's an additional cost, an additional activity. So I wonder if maybe we could move to your digital strategy, your income, and actually advertising. In your submission, you pointed towards declining advertising and challenges in actually being able to generate income from digital. Could you speak to your strategy there very, very briefly and give us a sense of what those challenges are that you're experiencing?
Sorry, I want my colleague on online to talk to that because, like I said, I don't want to be accused of editorial man talking about sales and selling news. Annie, can they hear us?
Sorry, Annie.
Yeah.
Annie, can you hear us? Do you want to come in?
I lost sound for a bit there. Can you please repeat your question? Can you hear me?
Hi, Annie, can you hear us?
I can't hear you guys. I lost sound for a bit. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yeah. Did you hear the
You-
question? Then, so the question really is, we kind of shifting from audience to digital strategy and the particular challenges that SABC has in terms of monetizing its digital space.
Okay, so currently we are now fast tracking on trying to sell on our digital space. And with the news app being put in place, we are looking at, well, revenue there. But not a lot of our advertisers usually go into the news space. They're more into the entertainment space than they are into news, depending on the business that they are into. So news does not get as much revenue as you would expect as our entertainment segments would, or our radio stations would, compared to news. So news doesn't get that much revenue as well.
Can I just ask, I mean, how it differs online versus legacy for news? Because just trying to think back to also when I last watched television, you know, those slots were prime time. There was a lot of people watching, and so you did sell. But now when we move online, when it's fragmented, then it just doesn't sell anymore. So just to understand that dynamic, I think, Ashra, you want to respond?
Yes, if you allow me. So the one thing that I think we've been talking about a lot is the fact that in sort of legacy media, news often occupied prime time space, and prime time space came with prime time advertising rates. And with news no longer necessarily in that prime time space, the SABC has certainly seen kind of a decline in the first of all the amount of advertising in that space, I think, and also in terms of the share. I do not know that there might be sort of any direct analogy, but I think we can also see that in terms of the license revenue collection. So with the advent of SABC news content specifically going online, when our audiences can access it anywhere, anytime, essentially the same content, in that same period, we have seen a very dramatic decline in the collection of license fees. Um, and, and I think for certain there can be a very strong analogy made in terms of how then the change in how people view our content has kind of impacted directly on revenue.
What other challenges are you also finding in terms of monetizing your content online? And we'll get to YouTube separately, but I'd like to particularly find out in terms of what restrictions you have as a broadcaster that actually publishes in different languages. Are you experiencing any particular challenges around that?
If you remember, during my introductory remarks, I did mention that, look, for example, in terms of that principle of universal access, we cannot put anything behind the paywall. We cannot really say this is our premium content. It's more available to everyone. So in terms of monetizing that, I'm not talking advertising, but in terms of monetizing, in terms of subscription, that's the challenge for a public broadcasting service to say, you cannot exclude the majority of your audience on the basis that you would want them to access it through a subscription, for example.
Do you have a sense in terms of your advertising income? What percentage of it comes purely from online?
Maybe Annie can answer that question. Annie? But it's not much in terms of online at the moment. We're still in terms of news generating through the linear platforms. Annie?
Hi. So I cannot give an actual number, but I do know that we did have some revenue come in. It's not, but not as much as you would assume it to be. Due to, as I said, due to certain clients, because they're very particular. I mean, we can't just advertise with any advertiser on news. We have to be very sensitive as to what clients we allow to advertise on our news platforms, because we have to be very careful. As we all know, we are judged by a mandate. So that's where the main issue is because we mandated, we know that SABC is under strict rules and regulations. So we can't just take money from any clients and just put them on news. They have to be in line with what our messaging is. And that's where the issue also comes in about news not getting as much revenue as we should be.
Thanks, Honey. Could we talk about your YouTube strategy? I mean, is that about an extension of your audience, an extension of mandate, or is it about also trying to derive income from existing products?
Technically, it's both, in a sense that while someone think of SABC News as the content, laying on the legacy platform, that's radio and television. That's what we realized, that actually even on the digital platforms, our audience wants to be visual in terms of how they consume our content. That is why, as I will give the figures, that is why that is the most performing, if you can put it, that digital platform that we have. And also led us to also rethink the strategy of our website to say, but people don't see us as heavy text, don't see us as a print newspaper, but as an audio-visual platform. So, as I've mentioned at the beginning, that also, if you look at the amount of content and audience compared to the revenue that we get from Google, YouTube, it's really it's kind of like an unfair compensation, if I can put it that way. Azra?
Yes, I think the YouTube obviously is our biggest sort of external platform, and performs relatively well. Our February numbers for views were over 19 million, almost 20 million views just for Feb alone. And we put a fair amount of resources into the content that we put there. It also allows us the freedom to do a number of things that television does not. So on or via our YouTube channel, we can do 5 streams simultaneously. So you can show 5 different kinds of events all at the same time. We're hoping to be able to do more, but that kind of thing, which allows our audiences a choice that they would not have had previously. And I think that for us is very important. But it's also important to note that that once again, at the time that we entered into our partnership with YouTube, I don't think any of us sort of anticipated what the result would be, first of all. But also it was the only available option we had at the time. And you know, when we entered into it, it was a discussion we were having the other day, actually. No one was even doing online transactions. So we didn't even have a proper credit card that we could use. Over the years, we found that the growth and the support generally has been fairly good and fairly consistent. However, at the same time, the lack of transparency in terms of how calculations are made, for example, and I'm not just talking about monetary calculations, I'm talking about accessing content and downloading content and, in fact, accessing our own content, has been very difficult to calculate. So it's those kinds of issues, as well as, of course, the transparency in terms of revenue collection, that proved to be very challenging. You know, a large amount of SABC news content is available on a platform like YouTube, and the return on that is very difficult, would be very difficult to calculate. I think even if one knew what the calculation boundaries were, but it is actually very, very unclear to us in terms of how that is calculated.
I believe, Annie, you want to come in on this?
Yes, I just wanted to agree with Azra because YouTube, okay, I'll put my camera on now. YouTube takes about, actually not about, they take 45% of our revenue. So that also means that we don't get as much revenue as we should, because YouTube takes a majority of the revenue in advertising. So they have their own set of clients that would advertise, and they would take majority of that advertising in terms of revenue.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that perhaps we should add here is there is no accounting. So nobody comes to me and says, okay, this is the story you put out, this is the money we've collected, and so here's your 45 or 55%, right? I don't know. I've got to take your word if you're paying me. There is no paperwork. There is, I can see on my channel, well, this is what your monthly revenue is, but how it is allocated, for example, and calculated, like I said, is just very unclear.
Thanks. Sorry, we do have a few hands online. I just want to confirm, though, that these are SABC employees. I think we've got a Celeste. All right.
Hi.
Celeste, please come in.
Hi, I'm Celeste. I'm from the digital department at SABC. I work with Annie. So what we've done is that in the last year, we've done a lot of, our team has done a lot of auditing. We've looked at our digital platforms, especially how we can increase and make money or revenue from it. So our strategy moving into the new fiscal 24-25 is that we are like the YouTubes, your Facebook, especially for live content. There is only a limited portion that you can go and stream live before it's actually cut off. So what we've started, especially now with SABC Plus, we're trying to migrate or divert our advertisers to SABC Plus and our audience to drive audience to SABC Plus to view the content. Because remember, on SABC Plus, all our linear platforms are simulcast on SABC Plus. So whether it's news, sports, SABC 1, 2, and 3, and then our radio platforms, it's all simulcast. What you hear on the radio and on TV, you see it on SABC Plus. So that is what we're trying to do for the new fiscal. We will have YouTube and everything, but we're going to try and drive our audience to SABC Plus so that we can now see the audience, and the audience can see the content via their phones and their websites. And that's how we're going to start creating revenue around the platforms as well.
I mean, that seems to suggest, and we heard from many who want to do the same, get you to their website direct, or that you can monetize this content more effectively yourselves than you can through a platform. The one question I did have on just YouTube is, I noticed that in their partnership program, you could bring ads direct to YouTube, and you could try and sell those at a premium because the advertisers would be guaranteed to be associated with your content. Is that something you've tried to make use of? And then also whether you also charge 45% for that as well?
No. So we've got a rate card. We've just launched our first ever SABC digital rate card. And on there, you've got YouTube, which we sell pre-rolls. And that is a new option, like an option that we now give to advertisers. And there's a CPM rate across the board for pre-rolls on the YouTube. And then what you like with news, and again, we'll say that with news, it's specific clients. It's all about the content or the pre-roll that we're going to apply to anything across digital when it comes to news. We have to go back to the news department just to clarify if the content can be used on YouTube as a pre-roll, like on the websites, on SABC Plus around news. So it needs to go with the mandate that news has. It's not like the other platforms. So you've got that specific little barrier that you have around news. So we do have a rate card. News is involved. News is our top performing digital platform currently, where the websites, it's performing very well, YouTube as well. So yes, we do have a rate card for it.
Thank you very much. Can we shift to social media? And if you could give us a sense if you're seeing any differences between your audiences who are using the website and radio and television versus your audiences who are actually consuming your stories on various social media platforms.
I have to be honest and say I don't think that we, in any real sense, measure our online audiences directly against radio and television, because first of all, we function in different workflows, right? So I don't think we do any sort of direct comparison in terms of actual content. I should say, though, that when we have, for example, content on television that we do share, for example, the online views that we get afterward show us that that people do come back to watch, and that often not only do they come back to watch content again and again, so the same users over again, but there are, I would say there's quite a marked difference when you look at new users coming to see a live stream, as opposed to I want to say old users, but regular users. So we see very marked differences. For some events, especially, we see very marked differences. So I think that very often there are a whole range of what could have been television audiences that are now catching it on the online platforms, and primarily because the majority of those users are accessing the content on their mobile phone. So if you take all those things into consideration, then yes, I think that the measurement is definitely there, that some of them are coming on, especially when you look at the devices that they are using to access.
So in your presentation, you raised two issues. You raised the issue of shadow banning of content, and you also raised the issue of that if the SABC had to pay to promote content, that in itself was went against its mandate. Could you expand on that and give us some examples of what you mean by that? Thanks.
Well, our team started playing around, experimenting with some Instagram content, I would say sometime in the middle of last year. And it wasn't doing fabulously well, but it was growing. And all of a sudden, around October, November, we saw a huge drop, not just in our Instagram content, but in terms of our Facebook numbers as well. And we couldn't figure it out because we weren't doing anything wrong. Nothing different. And in fact, I think at that stage we were putting in a little bit more effort than we had been doing previously. So we couldn't figure it out. And when we started considering what content we were sharing at that time, and what different online circles were saying about the content sharing, we came across them shadow banning thing, and we sort of initially presumed that that some of the content that we were sharing was being shadow banned or blocked, whatever the case might be. Later on, probably toward the end of November, December, we had some specific content, specifically some Palestine-Israel contact blocked for not meeting community rules and what have you. And when we put the whole experience together over that 2 or 3 months, we came to the very definite conclusion that our content was definitely in some ways not being shared. So two things there. One, that initially we didn't even know. We didn't know, we were not aware, and if we sort of hadn't done some, sort of background checking and chatting and being aware of what other people on the platform were saying about it, we would not really have figured it out. The other thing that we noted was a lot of the online community then started using different tactics to get around it, right? So they were using emojis, they were using symbols, which in the case of a news organization is not really an option. So that was the second thing about it, and we just sort of lay low for a little while before we started up again. We noticed a similar trend on our Facebook numbers at that stage, but once again, we don't have any kind of direct, sort of comparison to be able to say that that it happened on Facebook as well. But it's a presumption that I think we hold true. So yes, definitely in terms of the shadow banning, I think our experience was a very real one. The sharing of sponsored content was something that actually came up in the preparation for our submission. Every month we do an analytics report, which we hand to the GE, and the GE says, but your numbers are down, and why you're not getting the same sort of clicks and likes as your competitors. And then you start looking at the content that is being shared, and one of our biggest competitors, I went onto their Facebook page and clicked on the first story and realized it was sponsored content, and then clicked on the second story and the third story, and eventually something like, on the day that I checked, something like 80% of the content, maybe even more that I checked, was actually sponsored content. So presumably, they're getting paid to advertise. I would presume then if I was getting paid to advertise, I would pay to boost my content. It would be the clever thing to do, which as the SABC, of course, we're not able to do. And then came the third thing. So I click on a story, and that website obviously gets a click, right? So if you're an advertiser and you want to buy advertising, you're going to go there because there are a lot more clicks. The fact that I didn't read a single story because I don't subscribe means that actually no news content or sponsored content was actually shared at all. But this is what I said about the playing fields being uneven. You mark yourself as the most credible, largest online whatever news provider. But what news content is actually being provided? What are the platforms doing to ensure that if content is being marketed as credible news content, that is actually what it is? And I come back to the fact and say, we might, as the SABC, be very low resourced, and we might be putting out lesser content, or maybe even content of a lesser quality, if you want to say that. But the bottom line is that the quality that we put out on any one of our platforms is verified. It meets our editorial policies. It's checked. It's been through generally all the checks and balances. We do all those things, and if you click on it on any of our platforms, wherever we share it, you're going to access the content. You're going to see the picture. You're going to read the quote or hear the quote, whatever the case might be. You're not going to go up against a paywall. But if you're an advertiser and you come to me and you say, wow, but they have 60% more followers than you or more likes than you, what does that say then about evening the playing field and being sort of judged by the same measurements, because it actually is not.
On the shadow banning, were you able, as the public broadcaster with millions of followers, were you able to engage directly with Facebook?
No, we did not. We did not. Like I say, it kind of took us by surprise, and at some stage we weren't even aware of it until much later. The Human Rights Watch, I think, report on the shadow blocking was essentially what kind of put things into perspective for us. So yes, we did not even, to be quite honest, we didn't even appeal the strikes or the stories that were blocked. We didn't appeal it at all. Yeah.
And are you able to speak to someone at a Facebook or Instagram if you do have a problem? Is there someone you have a contact and they sort?
Can I pick up the phone? No. Yeah. So our relationship generally is just like any other individual, and we have to go through the same channels. I have to click on report this post or whatever the case might be in order which to do that. I think we do have a more a familiar relationship with YouTube specifically. But once again, we have very organic relationships. So we do meet them. We can send through a complaint or whatever, and generally, yes, there is follow up. It's the time differences. It's all those kinds of things. It's also being referred from one person to the other, which might take a week or 2 weeks, or that. But we, for now, my understanding is that actually we only have real direct contact with people at YouTube as opposed to any of the other platforms.
And then just on the boosted posts, I mean, I'm just battling a little to understand them. And I mean, it's one thing if it's sponsored, let's say, but we heard last week there's some news media that say, well, the story seems to be doing well, I will give it a boost just to drive more traffic back to me. Is that also something you feel you're unable to do given your mandate?
No, we won't. we won't pay to boost posts. I must say though that many years ago, can't think exactly which year it would have been, but it was the year that Barack Obama delivered the Nelson Mandela lecture, and we worked with YouTube at that stage to boost that particular stream. It was a single event. SABC did not pay for the boost. We were given sort of value. I can't remember what exactly the negotiation was. And it was a stream that did particularly well. I think right now, to date, it's about 14 million people or something like that. So it did particularly well for us. But that's the only time that I am aware. I've been loosely on and off involved with the Digital News Office for about 12, no, more than 12 years now. So for quite a long time. And as far as I'm aware, that's the only sort of real time or actual event that we worked on boosting a post. We do not do that as a matter of standard practice at all.
What we require from our side, sorry if I can interject, is just transparency on part of this third parties. Like what Asra is saying, I remember, I think a year ago, where you could see the quarterly numbers for the page views on our site did not make any sense. You would be 1 million up, the next quarter you are 1 million down, and it doesn't make any sense. To us, it's just the issue of transparency, as we have alluded to in our submission. Thanks.
And it's not just a certain kind of transparency or transparency at a certain point. It's transparency from A to Z. What are the ground rules? What are you doing? What do you expect? What do you get in return? What are you worth? What is the value? How do you make your profits? Are you giving us crumbs for the profits? It might have been a very different relationship when we started out without a credit card. The game has changed, but we are not, I don't even think we can talk about partners or collaborators or that unlevel playing field. There is nothing equal about that relationship. I mean, I'm not sure, Azra, do we have a final warning from YouTube? Okay, we've got a final warning with someone because we did something. And this was like my first meeting and introduction to them, and they were pretty hostile. And I'm like, if you could just put that amount of energy and effort into taking us as a proper partner or a collaborator, that would be great. I was like offended. Here they are, you've got to strike, you've got to strike. If you do this thing, you're going to... And that was my first experience. So I really think transparency in its broadest sense, from A to Z, what does it mean to play together? What does it mean to collaborate? And one other example that I think we haven't spoken about is that they have used our content and they have used our users to scrape and mine data. We do not get the benefits of that. We do not know what the profile is and what is wrong with them sharing that with us. I'm just using that as one example. So I think we must be quite careful and clear that when we talk about transparency, we literally mean from the alpha to the omega of that transparency. Thank you.
And I think, Annie, you want to come in on this?
Yes, just to go along with what was just said, the transparency but for our social media accounts. The thing is, we wouldn't also know if people are basically reporting SABC News posts, because Facebook has rules of posting. So if it's something that doesn't something that someone doesn't like, and you can actually block the content. So they'll see if they say that it's a threat or hate speech or graphic violence, they're going to actually report the post and then it will be removed. So we wouldn't be notified that, okay, someone has reported it. And that also plays quite a big role in the numbers that have dropped probably on our Facebook and our Instagram due to those rules and regulations on social media. So that is also kind of where we need to do a partnership with social media and metadata so that we can advertise that content. But that's how we usually get shadow banned or our content can be removed.
Thank you very much, Annie. We are running out of time really quickly, and I wanted to touch on the issue of AI and the particular challenges that you might be having regarding AI and the generation of AI video and content that might impinge on your copyright, but also the dangers in terms of your likenesses being used.
Yeah, before I hand over to Asra, to us is not even though it's still important, the issue of IP and copyright, but is the impact on our credibility, impact on our on the trust issue. I'll give you an example. We had several generative AI videos depicting our presenters as promoting some Elon Musk product. And specifically, they targeted our presenters, our on-air talent, who are associated with our bulletins and current affairs, which means out there, and that's why I even had to personally come to the studio to address it, that there are people who would believe that, oh, it's this is so and so who anchor this program, and it's promoting this product. So to me, is that kind of impact. Sure, we're still also internally looking at how do we approach the issue of AI, because not everything is negative when coming to AI. There are some aspects of AI that in future we need to embrace, but it's the question of the ethics of it, and also to say how do we approach it in terms of maintaining our credibility and also our ethics. How do we generate the content that is still credible, that is still generated by trained journalists who understand the ethical consideration, the editorial independence, and other factors that is associated with news content. Thanks.
Yes, I think the idea of credibility is possibly the most important here. But in this instance, with for example YouTube, I think it's also a case of size must matter. We have a huge following. We have SABC News has 9 different YouTube channels at present. So for me, if you can pick up that that one of the SABC programs might have used 5 seconds or 3 seconds of somebody else's content, it comes as a huge surprise that you can't pick up a 30-second advert with all our logos and straps and that kind of thing. So yeah, that it is advertising for the platform cannot be overlooked, and that surely then it implies that there are lesser standards for advertisers who are obviously not being checked or regulated. Regulated is the wrong word, but the content is obviously not being checked, and the impact is huge. In about a week ago, I was sitting outside enjoying some sunshine outside the SABC, and I got a call from somebody who had no idea who I was. They just searched SABC. Angie was with me. Searched and found my name and called me on my cell phone. And he said, "This is who I am. I am battling to find your account number." And I said, "I'm not understanding. It took a while for me to get to the bottom of it. But here is this man who has 5,000 rand. He wants to spend on the Elon Musk project that we are advertising on our platforms." And I mean, he's one person who at least took the time out to call, but there are hundreds of others who obviously haven't, who are clicking on these sites and who are finding themselves in a fair bit of trouble. I mean, I know our competitors even have had sort of similar issues to deal with. But it is no small thing. And you know, if these platforms cannot take care of credible content providers, news generators, then that is a problem. And it's not just a problem for news, but it's a problem for our country. Because surely, you know, access to information and the kind of information that is shared is something that needs to be seriously considered.
And I know that this is an inquiry that is focusing on the media and news, but often I look at the world through a user. And I think there are questions that we need to ask as users or so-called consumers in inverted commas. To what extent is there public protection of the big platforms? To what extent do they protect the public? Because that's my basis, and maybe that's because I've always been a public broadcaster, that's my reference. And linked to that, it's not only assisting the media and assisting news, and maybe we need, as the public broadcaster, public news service, a kind of preferential treatment, but to what extent do they do public education, public awareness? So here's an example that Azra mentions to you of someone who saw this ad, wanted to pay, give money. Had she not got hold of her, they could quite easily have spent 5,000 rand. So I don't know, maybe it's not coming across my Facebook page, my X page, my Google. I'm not seeing, unless it's hidden at the bottom, you know, more than just an about us, kind of the frequently asked questions, what to do in the event of, and that for me is the fundamental basis that underpins news and media. It's the public interaction, engagement, experience of these big search and social media companies, platforms.
I have one last question. I'll hand back to James. So you've spoken a lot about fair compensation, and I suppose we could debate what fair compensation is, but is your expectation that if you get this fair compensation, you will be able to fund your journalism a lot better?
Look, the expectation is that if we do, we should be able to sustain ourselves as the public broadcaster, because to me that's the essence of it, to say with the decline in the media, we are facing a situation where there will be lesser outlets, and those outlets also will be of a poorer quality. That is why I'm saying that sustainability to me is the most important, because we do have that obligation to the South African public. Like Philly posed, was it Philly or Angie posed a question to say, what will be the question, what will it look like when there is no SABC, or for that matter, there's no media in general, especially given the media's role in democracy, the media's role in empowering and informing the citizenry. To me, that's my biggest concern, to say, beyond that, and especially if you look at it to say, sure, we come from a period where we're dominant, sustainable, there's disruption. But disruption at the expense of what? Our content. And if that's the case, then fair compensation to be able to sustain ourselves, to also to continue to be meeting that mandate and obligations. Thanks very much.
I just got a couple of last questions. One was, I mean, I'm interested in just almost the historical content, because often we focus on the immediate now and the events. But certainly what I find is when I sort of want to research something, because something is reported in the news, often news will come up, and that may also be on YouTube as well from a video perspective. Just from your perspective, the views you get and what content, I mean, is there a fair bit of that sort of historical, and it may not be deep history and it may not be archive, but if I wanted to find out what happened, you know, like going back to, say, the World Cup, or there's content that is still there that talks about, because we heard last week, I mean, the media is also a record of the country, of life. So are you seeing much in terms of views? I don't know if you can detect it, of that sort of content.
Yes, I think to some extent we tend to ignore the sort of historic views as opposed to, you know, what's happening now. So we look at a monthly view or quarterly view, whatever. But but certainly there's some content that continues to grow. One of our biggest lifetime videos is the video of anchor Vuyo Mvoko getting robbed while he was live on air. And, you know, it was huge when it happened, but to date, we still see people coming back and viewing it. The Barack Obama lecture, for example, still gets views now, and from our YouTube lifetime, that's sort of quite historic. We some years ago did a lovely widget on 25 years of democracy, and we've been re-looking at some of the archive content that we use there, and we still see some views on that. In fact, that content, I mean, if you go onto our website right now, there's no direct link to that content, but on YouTube it's there and it's still getting views. So I think that says a lot about what we're putting out and the fact that people do go back. When, for example, there are linked stories, you know, 5 years down the line, something happens and then, you know, you go back and you say, oh, well, you know, that's what happened there, or you link it, or a person, you know, does something and you go back and you look at the historic content. Yes, those kinds of patterns come up all the time, and yes, we do see that kind of historic content show up very, very often.
In fact, just to supplement that answer is that, you know, the internet, we do pay, the media in general, we do pay international news agency for international content. And that subscription is hefty. Sometimes you're talking about 55 million over 3 years or so. However, the same content that you is relevant to your question. The same content that you might have used on your platform and paid for, you will be told. I mean, I remember for personal experience in my other role where you will be told that the same content, if you're going to use it a week later, you have to pay for it as archive. So they understand also the importance of the historical content in terms of its value. So yeah, it's very important what you say.
So not only are we governed by the Broadcasting Act, the Electronic Communication Act, and everything else, but one of our roles is also governed by the National Archives. Now, besides the National Archives in Pretoria and wherever it may be located for fire purposes, we are the repository and the custodian of radio broadcasting in this country that dates back to, I don't know, Howard Carter finding Tutankhamun's cave or something. Or Mahatma Gandhi on the train. So that is an important thing, I think, to realize as well. And how did TV start? Where did TV start? 1975 with the trial, testing, experimenting broadcast. So that's a critical thing, and we might have challenges with digitization and digitizing all those formats from reel to reel and, I don't know, deep reel, whatever you want to call it, deep reel, deep archives. But I think that's the other thing about the SABC as the public broadcaster, public news service, we are the custodians and the repository of archives. And I think so much has happened with going into the digital space. I mean, I'm still sitting with different formats, from cassette to floppy disk to stiffy disk to U drives and flash drives, and it's difficult to kind of digitize that. But I think that's the critical thing when you talk about, you know, the public record. You know, if the New York Times is considered as still the public record in the USA, I think that's how we still regard ourselves, as the repository, the custodian of the public record.
Well, I just want to maybe thank now the SABC for coming to these public hearings, sending us a very high-powered delegation and giving us the insights through the questions and answers. I certainly think we have a better grasp of exactly your mandate, and your archive role, I think, is also important. But also the public has that. And we'll certainly pick up some of these themes with some of the platforms as they come and talk to us as well. So thank you very much.
Many thanks.
And then we're going to break until 5 o'clock when we have Microsoft. Thank you.